Well, today on Rebuilders, we are looking at some things that are happening in the world.
Yeah, we are asking a hard question but a necessary question, which is, are we sleepwalking into a global conflict? We've almost become a bit immune to the news from Ukraine. We, I think, continue to be horrified by the images we see coming out of the Middle East. We are concerned by the direction that we see so many parts of the world. And number one, how do we understand all this? How do we perceive what seems like just this complex patchwork of conflicts around the world that seem to be really spinning out of control? And then I think, how do we pray about this? How do we approach this as Christians? Where is this taking us? We ask all those questions and more in today's episode.
Yeah, we look forward to sharing it with you. And just a reminder before we get into it, we have a live Rebuilders recording with a bit of a mashup with Renaissance Movement and Al Gordon here in Melbourne on the 22nd of October. That is next week, a Tuesday evening from 7:30 p.m. If you have yet to grab your tickets, you can head to rebuilders.co and secure them there. We'd love to see you. Let's get into the episode. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you guys?
Good. It's been a while.
6 weeks, I think.
6 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah. 6 weeks of sleepless nights because I've missed sitting across the room.
Yes.
Recording Rebuilders.
Does that mean that you've taken up drinking coffee?
Never.
Not yet.
I would not stoop to such levels.
Yes. Well, my sleepless nights were more due to large amount of flights and time zones, and was able to get across quite a few different places in the US and also visit our cousins across the ditch in New Zealand. And really fantastic. I know we often say this, but I think this trip just seemed like so many listeners I met. So thanks to all who came up. So good to hear in person how the podcast is helping people, inspiring people. I met some deep cut people who'd followed us from the beginning as well,
wow.
which is great. And so hello to everyone who said hello, and hello to those of you who didn't say hello. That doesn't make any sense, but we'll keep going.
Yeah, we can keep
I want
going.
to be inclusive of all.
Yeah. Of all helloers and non-helloers. It's great to have you back, Mark.
Good to be back.
Yeah.
Good to be back in Melbourne.
Yeah. What's the thing you were most excited about when you landed back in Oz?
I mean,
the pastries?
No. I'm just going to sum it up as this: Australia. I don't know. It's always good to come home, and you just go, yeah. I mean, it's great to visit places, but
there's no place like home.
There's no place like home. No place like.
Did you high five border security as you came in?
I was high fiving. I was,
yes,
starting chants of Aussie, oi, 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 as we waited for our baggage. No.
Wearing your green and gold.
Yeah. Holding a stuffed kangaroo.
Yeah.
Cobra.
Yeah, fighting off deadly animals. I did in San Francisco pull them up. I think it was in San Francisco. Yeah, because the classic thing in America.
Who'd you pull up?
America. America. No, because the classic thing is like you go to America and two things people say is, oh, wow, I'd love to go to Australia, but it's such a long flight.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I just was in the air for over 50 hours or something in the last month. But the second thing people say is, oh, there's so many deadly animals. So I'm in Alamo Park, which is near where the painted ladies are. From Full House.
Yep.
I prefer to think of it as the park, which is at the beginning of Donald Sutherland's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, a far superior piece of popular culture. But I'm in that park and there's like signs up for like beware of coyotes.
Oh, really?
And bears.
And then I see an article over there. There's there's a mountain lion rocking around LA. Like in the, I don't know if you saw, there was the video from like Florida, and there was a news reporter, and she's reporting, and then she's like, oh, there's a dog coming, and she goes, I don't know if that's a dog, and it's a mountain lion like walks past her. Yeah, bears, rattlesnakes. They've got sharks. They've got massive tarantulas. They're hairy. So I rebuked them. I rebuked them. I'm not doubting. And I was saying, like, to get some of these animals that you're afraid of, I have to fly 3 hours. The Australian ones they talk about, they're like 3 hours flight away.
Yeah.
They're closer to Indonesia than my house.
I did see an article. Apparently snakes are migrating into the suburbs at the moment, so.
My auntie who lives
Don't ruin my argument.
Fearmonger.
my auntie who lives in regional Victoria, sort of northwest area.
I shouldn't have brought this up with the
yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, sent through a
country
photo in our
kids.
family chat the other day of a brown snake at her back step.
Well, this is the country to all the Americans listening, and I've always lived in the city, and I've never
Yeah.
seen anything.
Yeah.
I think I could be.
But I don't. That's not to dismiss your
No, I
tales
don't.
from the country.
I've actually seen a number of them around Melbourne as well, but
Where have you seen them?
on the Merry Creek Trail.
It's in bush.
That's not the bush.
It's yeah.
That's
Okay,
Clifton
all right.
Hill.
All right, okay, fair enough. But again, too, like I've been at people's houses
Yes.
in LA, and they're like, "Oh, there's a rattlesnake in our backyard."
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
So
it's the same story here.
It's the
Yeah.
same story. America is no different
Yeah.
with your deadly animals.
Well, greetings to all of our
sorry, that got-
mountain
that got
lion
passionate.
listeners.
Yeah.
So, look, today let's get into the episode. There is a lot to cover in this episode. We are a podcast that explores a number of different things, but often we look at what's going on in the world, looking at the big things that are happening in culture and geopolitics and all of that kind of thing, and then understand how it kind of relates to us as Christians, as leaders. Today, we're tackling the rather large topic of war. There are a lot of conflicts that are progressively getting more and more out of control across the world. And so we're going to be talking about that today in a number of different ways. So I'm going to kick us off with, Mark, are we sleepwalking into war?
Yes. And I think this question is going to be the framing of
Yeah.
this entire episode. And I just also want to say at the start, before I jump into the concept of sleepwalking, is I think this is probably, I think what we're trying to always do with Reboot is like, what's the big thing that perhaps is going to change the world and affect things, and perhaps people don't understand or maybe not even seeing.
Yeah.
And I think there's obviously, we're a couple of weeks out, 3 weeks out or something from the US election. There's a bunch of stuff happening in the world, but I just wonder whether this is actually the biggest trend line in the world. So the question is, are we sleepwalking into war? The term sleepwalking comes from the Australian historian Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, which came out maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago or something. And really it's a book about World War I and the events that led up to World War I. Classically, how World War I is taught that, World War I began because of Germany's aggression. But Christopher Clark in the book paints a more complex picture where he says really there was almost this element where no one really wanted war, but they found themselves like sleepwalking into war. If you think you're sleepwalking, you're not aware, but you're actually perambulating towards something.
Yeah.
He sort of says this happened for really a couple of reasons. Number one, that individual leaders were making decisions without the awareness of the larger strategic effects of that. So someone might be making a decision because of local politics, not realizing that decision is moving them towards a world war. Mm-hmm. The second thing was that, Europe was connected, and not just Europe, but, there was a lot of empires connected as well. So that brought in the whole world there was interlocking alliances and blocks. So if two countries went to war, that then meant those alliances were then activated, and it meant everyone was at war. Mm-hmm. The sort of rational decision-making, because the world had actually been at peace for some time, it was a bit of a golden period up until 1914, that what happened was that sort of rational decision-making, rational diplomacy went out the window because sort of national tensions and geopolitical tensions meant that countries went to war and the rational side of was overrided. And then sort of lastly, just the sheer scale of the endeavor, the complexity of trying to avoid war, but then all of the different, if we're going to do diplomacy, but if you're going to not do that, you need to then have that happen and this happen and this happen. And just the complete complexity was too much for the politicians and the diplomats to overcome. And so, really we had the great tragedy, and, I've been to the Western Front where it's quite incredible where, you just see not just obviously there were, British and French and German troops there, but then colonial troops, there's like African, like memorial sites, and obviously the Australian, New Zealand Army Corps was there. And, I've visited a grave where, my relative was buried, and just the sheer scale of death was, made this an incredible tragedy. And you could argue that therefore World War I leads to the Great Depression, leads to World War II. So, it really was one of the great tragedies. And in many ways, what we're going to sort of dig into, and I won't fully go into it, but, reason I give it that framing is I think if we look at this with clear eyes of our current situation and we look at it from a macro view, disturbingly, some of these factors that Christopher Clark outlined that was occurring leading up to 1914 are currently present in our situation.
Sure.
We, in early old school COVID days of the podcast, did a series on the networked world.
Yes.
We talked about how things that used to be far are now close. And in a sense, we're all connected and crises cascade through the network. And perhaps at that time we were talking about misinformation, disinformation, Russia's involvement, say, in the US election or, stuff like this. But really, I think what we're seeing now is an intensification of that process where we're now talking about networked forms of war. Now, there are multiple different types of war. There's economic war, there's trade war, there's information war, there's moral war, there's political war. And it's just worth noting that probably in 2020, but, pushing into 2021, all of those things were at play. The US is at economic war with China. There's a trade war in the world at the moment. There's been informational war for some time. Part of the cultural polarization thing is about actually information war. There's moral war. Who is more moral? Again, part of the cultural war. And then there's obviously political war. But then the last one is when you're fully in war is what's called kinetic war. That's actually blowing up stuff, shooting people. But kinetic war really has two layers. The first one you could say is a proxy war where almost you fight each other by paying someone else or supporting two other actors to fight. So for some time, there's been a number of proxy wars in the world in the last few years. But then there's a point when you're in full-blown war when you sort of click over from proxy wars drag you in, and then you go from two countries fighting on your behalf to actually the two countries facing each other. So for example, you saw this in say, the Korean War, where the Chinese and Russians were supporting the North Koreans, the communists at the time, and the US and the United Nations were supporting the South Koreans. But then there was a point where literally US soldiers were fighting Chinese soldiers in Korea. So that's when you're in a direct war. And the other thing I say is really present in our current situation. I mean, the fact that, you open the newspaper and, so much of American domestic politics is driving things. Short-term thinking around cost of living or inflation, and again, too, these things are knock-on from the Ukraine war, some of this. We've got to see this.
Yeah.
But the short-term thinking of, we're still in the world that existed in 2019, that's still at play. So very much that short-term thinking just on what's happening in your nation. And one of the big trends, and I may come back to this as we round out this episode, is increasingly your national reality or even your city reality or region reality is driven by events on the other side of the world that you don't have control over and probably your leaders don't have control over. So that means that we're in complexity. So this what's happening in the world is, and we'll dig into this. So this will be a meaty episode, but I think it's important, realizing that complexity. So just last point in are we sleepwalking into war? I think two things. When the Ukraine invasion happened on the 24th of February 2022, we did an episode on it, one of our biggest downloaded episodes, and there was a sense that the world changed. You look at it changed the reality of Europe. The fact that even in the US election at the moment, aid to Ukraine is a huge issue. It's a huge issue politically in Europe.
Yeah.
Even Australia, in northern Victoria, where you were just sharing about your relatives, sending you photos. They're making Bushmaster armored vehicles for the Ukraine war. So the war changed. And what that meant is even economically, I think the sort of face of Europe radically changed. And things like the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, Europe's energy has completely changed, culture, refugees. And then I think the second thing is, a year ago or just over a year ago in a week, we also, probably around this time actually, a year ago, we did an episode on October 7th with Hamas's attack and incursion into Israel. And I think looking back, those two events have radically reshaped the global order. They have changed things. And the sense you get is the genie is not going back into the bottle. I remember talking to someone who is quite a sort of connected person and, at the, it was about a year, maybe 8-9 months after the Ukraine war, and they were hopeful that it would sort of simmer down and things would go back to normal. And it just hasn't happened. And, and I think like the Middle East is not going back to what it was. So a new cultural order will arise from these changes. We don't know what it's going to look like. And the real issue is how devastating that process of change will be. So that's just to outline where we are. This is a very, very serious state of affairs.
Well, thank you for helping us kind of understand the context that we're in. We're going to sort of explore more specific sites of war, I suppose. And we're going to start with Israel versus Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran.
Yeah. Okay, so, when we did the Israel-Palestine issue, basically episode, and I'm not going to go over a lot of that. We really, again, because if you want to listen, you can go back to the episode. But really, basically what happened at that time is the Hamas incursion had occurred. Israel had not responded militarily at that stage. But the real concern is, the sense I had, is that Israel, because of the scale and the ferocity of the attacks, was going to go into Gaza in a devastating way, and that has happened. And obviously, there's so many factors at play here. So what I'm not going to do here is go back over that, because really the conflict is moving on. So what I wanted to try and do is give people a picture of where that conflict is, because it's far bigger now than just Israel versus Hamas in Palestine and what happened in Gaza, or is happening in Gaza. So to go back a little bit, during the Trump presidency, one of the sort of things that his government had been working on was something called the Abraham Accords. And what the Abraham Accords was a normalization of relations between really Israel and the Sunni Arab nations, which would include Saudi Arabia primarily, but also the Gulf states like UAE and so on. And this was seen as something which would bring peace, and then when Biden won the election, got in, that sort of seemed to be continuing, and Jake Sullivan, who was the US National Security Advisor, just before October 7th said, the Middle East has never been as quiet as it is now. Okay, but what was happening in the background of that is that for some time you've had a strategic rivalry, which has been a kind of war, hasn't gone into full war, but it has been a proxy war between really Iran and the Saudis, Shia and Sunni. And what's known as the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is, this split over, and a lot of the history of, if you look at the history of the Middle East, the history of the Caliphate, throughout history, it's like, here's the sort of global Islamic homelands. Who's going to control it? At different times, it's been Sunni or Shia or Turks or, different groups, Egyptians. And so there's been this long-standing tension between the Iran and Saudi. So if there was a deal done between Israel, the US, and then the Saudis and the Sunnis, that would put Iran in a really difficult position because everyone would be against them.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that there was ongoing instability in the Middle East is because a large part of the Muslim world was anti-Israel. But if all of a sudden things were normalized with Israel, that would, take a lot of what is Iran's sort of modus operandi of having influence in the Middle East out. So what happened was there's been a number of proxy engagements in the past. And what Iran's done is create something called the Shia Crescent. And the Shia Crescent really was this vision of having different proxy armies in the countries surrounding Israel to put pressure on Israel, but also sort of be a bit of a defensive wall. And so you had, Shia linked with the Iraq war. You then had Shia linked militia, which are linked to Iran in Iraq. You had the Assad regime, which when the Arab Spring happened, the Iranians backed the Assad regime, and the Saudis were backing some of the people against the Assad regime. In Yemen, which is to the south of Saudi, you had the Houthis, who are a Shia group, rebel, and Iran backed them. And then there's been a war in Yemen where the Saudis and the UAE were like fighting on the side. So there's been all these proxy wars. But a lot of these militias were held together by a man called Qasem Soleimani, who was the sort of head of the Iranian or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now, he was droned by Trump in Iraq. And, then that, was a huge blow, which made that Iran has really wanted to get back at Trump. Interestingly, in the background, I'll come back to that in the US bit. Remind me about Trump assassinations and Iran. Yep. Okay, so obviously to the north of Israel, there's Lebanon. And Lebanon has been through a series of tremendous crises. We could go back to history. I won't go back as super far, but obviously the COVID really hit Lebanon incredibly tough. Lebanon's currently going through the worst economic depression of anywhere in the world since 130 years ago. Lebanon had the Beirut bomb blast, which goes back to Hezbollah, which I'll explain why Hezbollah are in a second, which was like a nuclear bomb almost going off in town as like fertilizer and possibly, like stuff was being stored there, possibly for sending on to Syria for use in explosives. And you have in Lebanon really a failed state. And Lebanon traditionally has been ruled by various militia, but one militia basically began to dominate the rest of them because Iran was backing them, which is a group known as Hezbollah, which is the party of God. Hezbollah's army is bigger than many European armies. So it's a militia, but it's incredibly significantly powerful. Plus, it's also connected to an international crime syndicate. So a lot of the drug dealing coming through Central America, Brazil, there's influence of Hezbollah in Brazil, in Colombia, in Venezuela, and they make a lot of money. And in a sense, it's almost become a bit of a money laundering front for the country of Iran, and incredibly powerful, and has been an international terrorist organization for a long time. So you've had them above Israel. So what's happened is, as Israel's gone after Hamas, there was this sense of the Shia crescent should then respond. And you've had Iraqi militia firing, the Houthis firing in, and Hezbollah fired in. But what Israel are now doing is seeing this as an opportunity to basically, let's get rid of all of our enemies. So you're now seeing the real danger was not as much, in terms of going to a larger war, was not around the confrontation with Hamas. Hamas is much smaller than Hezbollah. But Hezbollah has been there and was always seen as a security threat, particularly to Israel. The people in the north of Israel have had to flee as missiles have come in. So Netanyahu has dealt with this issue of a fleeing population in the north and these displaced people within Israel, which has created a political problem for him. So basically, they've decided to go into, at this stage, in a southern Lebanon to sort of create a buffer zone. But what they've also been doing is taking out the leadership of Hezbollah, most notably Hassan Nasrallah, who is the head of Hezbollah, which is a huge thing. You also saw the pager attacks where they had this incredible James Bond-like plot of, I think it was over 10 years with multiple supply chains around the world to build these pagers, and blew up, basically because the Hezbollah was afraid that if they had, normal sort of communications, Israel could hack it. So really what you see now is increasingly a war, not just in Gaza between Hamas and Israel, but we're now seeing a full-scale war developing, getting worse every day between Hezbollah and Israel. You've also then got, and I appreciate everyone if your head's spinning with the detail here. This is complex. You've also got backing onto Lebanon. You've also got Syria, where Iran is involved. So Israel's hitting targets in Syria, and then in Yemen, the Houthis. When October 7th happened, and then Israel went into Gaza, they basically blockaded the Red Sea. Now, this has tremendous global implications because the Red Sea is one of the world's busiest trading routes. They basically cut a channel through the desert.
Yeah.
And now so much of traffic has to go around the bottom of Africa and back up, which adds days and fuel, which is adding inflationary pressure. And just recently what's begun to happen, and this is where we'll get into the international dynamics of this, is Russia is now supplying missiles to the Houthis. The Houthis are also firing on Western ships. And the US went in and some of the NATO sort of forces went in to try and stop the Houthis, but they've been quite unsuccessful. So effectively, you've got the world's busiest trade link being shut down by what is happening here. Okay, so this then bleeds into, the domestic politics of a number of countries. So, the US has been a long supporter of Israel. It's been this sort of almost ironclad alliance between the two. But increasingly, as Israel's actions in Gaza and now in Syria, the severity of them, it's creating a split. For the Democrats, this is really challenging because there's Arab American voters plus also members of the further sort of left of their party who are splitting off now. And also members of the far right are also sort of turning on Israel as well. US has just sent 100 troops to Israel and some of its THAAD missile defenses to Israel. And this is what happened in Vietnam. You saw advisors come in. We'll just train some people. We'll send more advisors. We'll send some troops to protect the advisors. We'll just send a small infantry, like whatever. And then this is where the escalation scale continues. So it's hugely problematic for US domestic politics, and Israel's real place in the world has suffered a tremendous blow. But it's almost like the pressure that the US formally could put on Israel seems to not be working. But then also the US also wants to counter Iran. So if they're just like, we're pulling out of Israel, and maybe the Democrats want to do that, but the fact is then you could see an ascendant Iran attack Israel, which would be a nightmare for the Middle East and just general geopolitical stability. Russia is also involved. Russia went into Syria. Russia is supplying missiles to the Houthis. Russia, we'll talk more about this, has an alliance with Iran. But complex for Russia is that there's a large amount of dual citizens of Russia and Israel. And the Russian speakers in Israel are quite politically influential. So Russia's playing this really difficult balancing game with Israel and this conflict in the Middle East. And Israeli politics are also complex because, Benjamin Netanyahu was facing, before October 7th happened, this big protest movement. There was questions of his legitimacy, and there was just protests across Israel. So he had to align to stay in power because of corruption charges with the more extremes of the Israeli far right and the settler movement. And so in many ways, that has driven a more extreme push. So look, we could keep going, but effectively what we're seeing is that the entire order of the Middle East is being reshaped. And I think that there is a sense where Israel now is increasing. Clearly, Iran is wanted to fight this battle through proxies. It has an escalation ladder that it doesn't want to go above. But it just feels now like Israel's like, the world's against this. We've gone after Hamas. We've gone into after Hezbollah. There's an element like, if you're going to take out Iran, you need to take it now. Lastly, Iran for some time has been pursuing a nuclear program. And so Israel, if they see that Iran has a nuclear program and they're working on it, that is an existential threat for Israel. So there's an element that Israelis want to go after Iran. So where does this all go? This all goes to the potential that what we seem to be slowly moving over the last year is increasingly to a full-blown scale conflict between Iran and Israel, which will draw into most of the various Middle Eastern nations. So you move from what we've had in the past of a conflict in, Iraq or in Syria, where they've been contained with proxy players, to actually direct conflict with multiplicity. You've got the US fleet in the Mediterranean, you've got the British in Cyprus, and the danger is then that Western powers or the Russians or whoever could get dragged into it as well. So that's effectively the situation in Iran. And the concerning thing is, every 2 or 3 days you check the news it just gets worse.
Yeah.
There's more problems at play as well. And we saw too that, in the wake of some of the destabilization that happened in previous conflicts in the Middle East, jihadism grows in that. I think al-Zarqawi, who was the head of ISIS, who was originally in Al-Qaeda, talked about the fact that, he was radicalized by what he saw as Israel's, earlier war in Lebanon. So the images that we're now seeing on the internet, even just yesterday, some terrible images of, children being burnt is going to drive a new wave of radicalism in the Middle East and beyond.
Yeah. I'm just going to take you back to something that you asked me to remind you of, which I should have a little while ago.
Oh, yes.
The Trump assassination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So because Trump took out Qasem Soleimani, since then Iran has promised revenge. And so after Thomas Crooks got on that roof and had a few shots at Trump and just narrowly missed him, really interesting, the next day the US, and I think it was the next day or the day after, they basically said, look, there is active plots in the US done by Iran to assassinate Donald Trump and members of his former cabinet.
Right.
Am I saying Thomas Crooks was part of that? I don't know. We don't know a lot. We know they had encryption overseas, but whether that's completely separate thing is just some loner who had a pot shot or whatever else, there are active Iranian agents in the US trying to kill Donald Trump. Now, interestingly, yesterday, Biden made a very interesting statement, which was if Iran kills Trump, the US will see it as an act of war. So we've had two attempts on Trump. So again, that's just another effect of the destabilization. I just use that as another example of external threats coming in, destabilizing a country. We can also talk about that the Republicans tend to be more Sunni, Israel, Saudi aligned, and that the Democrats, I think possibly in the wake of 9/11 and possibly some of what they know about Saudi complicity in some of that, have also, there's almost been Obama tried to move towards normalizing relations more with Iran and exclude Saudi. So that's also going on in the background. So when Trump won the presidency, the Saudis had him in, they were loving, he was dancing. So also there's this interesting Democrat, Republican, who you align with dynamic as well.
Yeah, which is, I guess, interesting in light of the fact that the election is coming in a couple of weeks.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to Ukraine.
Yeah, so look, while this is all happening, you also have Ukraine. And what we've continued to see is this war of attrition. But Russia is slowly creeping forward and taking more of the country. And Russia very much has completely re-pivoted to sort of like a wartime economy. It's repivoted industrially to a wartime economy, and the sanctions really haven't had the effects that people thought. The sanctions have possibly affected energy prices globally, but these stories we had of I remember when the sanctions were first put in place, people were saying Russia's going to collapse and there'll be a revolution in 3 weeks or something. Hasn't happened, and actually Russia's economy is outperforming some Western European economies. To clearly counter this. And, you can speculate on the reasons for this. Then you had Ukraine go into Russia. So Ukraine went into Russia. They'd done a few little things before. Some of the units had gone in and stuff like that. But they went and have taken a chunk of the Kursk region. And the Russians are trying to, extricate them out of their own country. Now, I think possibly one of the reasons for that was they know Donald Trump could win the presidency, will want to negotiate, and this is a bargaining chip for the Ukrainians to be at that table, but also perhaps to stop being forced into negotiation where they end up losing a significant part of their country.
Sure.
To see how this is their networking effects spreading out, yesterday or the day before, Zelensky basically revealed, which there have been some reports of it, that North Korea is now directly involved in fighting. So we knew that North Korea was supplying ammunition, providing more ammunition than Western Europe was able to provide. And there'd been this sort of like deepened alliance between North Korea. Putin had visited Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang. And I think he also went Un went into Russia to see some of their missile stuff as well. But Zelensky's saying there are now actually North Korean troops fighting. So again, too, this is one of those things which, if this was in 2007, this would just be a massive story. I mean, think about this. You've got North Korean troops fighting in a land war in Europe.
Yeah.
And it's just like, a point in the third paragraph of an article. The other interesting thing is that South Korea is providing, the US has done some deals where a large amount of Ukraine's ammunition is being provided by South Korea. So there's just the interconnectedness of it. And just again to talk about the escalation, so what we've seen is, when the Ukraine war first happened, there was elements of like, we'll give them money, we'll give them some limited weapons, we won't give them HIMARS, missiles. Oh, they got HIMARS missiles. We won't give them tanks. We're going to give, and they've now got tanks. We're not going to give them fighter jets. They've now got fighter jets. We're not going to let them fire into Russia. They're firing into Russia. They can't do incursions. So you just see this is the escalation thing, which happens slowly. But just keeps happening. And this is one of the concerns about this spilling over to a larger conflict is when you're seeing the escalation scale continually go up versus going down, that is not a good trend line to follow. And, Macron made some comments a few months ago where, offhand he was recorded saying that next year he's probably going to have to send French. He said something like, quote, I think it was, I'm going to have to send some French boys into Ukraine.
Wow.
So, the talk of if Russia continues to advance, what does that mean? Will NATO have to send troops in, or would NATO send in, get the Poles to go in? The Poles are one of the biggest armies in Europe now. They've got American kit. It's a growing economic nation that's ascending. They have a long history of antagonism towards Russia. The Baltic states are not happy if they keep taking ground. So again, too, the possibility of this, cascading into some crises is very real. You're also seeing now 2 years on, at the beginning across Europe and the world, there was a lot of support for Ukraine. You're seeing that wane. This is what Russia was backing. If Donald Trump gets in, he's going to cut. He says he's going to do a deal on day one. Good luck. But he, effectively, JD Vance has sort of said this, there'll be a significant cut of what Ukraine's financial backing and military backing is. That will put more pressure on the European Union. Already, European citizens' initial high level of support is wavering. This is becoming an issue across European politics. Germany is swinging, like you've seen the pressure put after, the German economic model was really based on manufacturing and cheap Russian gas.
Yeah.
The Russian gas is gone. And so you're seeing France, Germany, countries swinging to the right. And you're seeing the element of Ukraine will be an increasing dynamic in that. So, basically, again, where we land is this is ongoing destabilization in Europe and beyond.
I just, as you were...
Also, can I say one thing?
Yeah,
Sorry,
of
before you
course.
jump in. Also, what we're seeing is these two conflicts blurring. So in a sense...
This was going to be my question.
The Russians are using Iranian Shahed drones.
Yeah.
The Russians are sending just as the US sent air defense to Israel, the Russians are sending air defense to Iran. And so you're seeing this interconnectivity between the two. So if you think about these two conflicts now, they're touching Asia, they're touching Europe, and they're touching the Middle East.
Yeah. All right. Well, what's happening in Taiwan?
Okay, so the third part of this, which is not at a kinetic war, the stage of the others, but yesterday China finished a significant large-scale naval exercise. I'm doing quote marks with my fingers here for the listeners. Exercises where they basically surrounded Taiwan and began to inspect ships that were coming through.
Right.
Taiwan's obviously an island. It's off China. It's in the passage between China and Taiwan is one of the world's biggest shipping routes. Taiwan is responsible for the production of a large amount of the world's sort of semiconductor chips, which are necessary in the production of AI.
Okay.
So they're good for computer games, But if the world wants to go where it wants to go with AI, plus also your mobile phone, all of this sort of stuff. So you've got an island which its future has huge consequences on the world's technology.
Yeah.
So, Xi, the leader of China, has paid it part of his legacy to reunify Taiwan with China. Taiwan has a long history, has its own indigenous population, but when the sort of Chinese Civil War sort of came to a really sort of like conclusion, the nationalist forces by Chiang Kai-shek basically decamped to the island. And so they see themselves as China, but there's been this sort of like strategic ambiguity, they call it, where the US won't recognize Taiwan as a country, but it sort of does. Same with Australia. So you'll see weird things at the Olympics or the World Cup where it's referred to as, something else than Taiwan. But effectively, Xi has said that his sort of like legacy thing that he wants to do before he dies is reunify it to the mainland. So they see it as a province that has attempted to secede, from the Chinese mainland. So you're seeing an escalation of intense military effects by China. Now, various intelligence agencies are saying that you could see the island taken in the next 2 years or in the next few years. Like there's this window of opportunity. And one of the things that could happen was through a blockade. Right. So basically it's like a medieval siege where China surrounds the island. And the US at various times, Biden basically said this, that if China does that, the US will respond militarily. And that could draw in South Korea, Japan, our country into this. And also this is connected to China seeing that it's contained by these forces, which it sees as proxies of America, the Japan, South Korea, even Australia's new submarines getting up there.
Yep.
So there's this sense where there's a tremendous battle on around the South China Sea. So, for example, the Philippines Navy is complaining about how Chinese are, sort of ramming their boats. There's these islands that the Chinese have militarized, which are disputed islands. And so you've got all these countries from Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, all of this is in play. So again, too, this is another area where, you've got fighter jets buzzing each other. One thing goes wrong and we're in big trouble here. So again, that dynamic that at some stage something's going to happen with Taiwan. Now, I think China at the end of the day would prefer it to happen politically, but is that possible? Because Taiwan has increasingly created an identity, set apart China as a liberal democracy. So again, to that factor is the big one. And the effects of if Taiwan happen will be far beyond what has happened with the economic and geopolitical effects of Ukraine, particularly because of the technology and trading routes around Taiwan. And again, too, I hate to land there again, but this is just something you can just pencil in the calendar for the next few years of this is just going to drive destabilization.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those are the sort of big ones, but there are a bunch of other wars that are happening at the moment.
And I'm not going to go through these in huge detail, but effectively we have a terrible conflict in Sudan, which is basically a civil war between elements of the military. Arguably worse death tolls than what we're seeing in Gaza, but tiny percentage of the coverage. But again, really interesting. The Ukrainians are backing some factions. The Russians are backing others.
Wow.
There are Ukrainian troops that have been photographed in Sudan.
Yeah.
You also have a battle in Myanmar between basically the opposition and various ethnic groups against the government. The government's being backed by Russia and China. The other groups are being backed by groups like India and so on. North Korea yesterday blew up large parts of its road and train network into the south and have put their troops on high fire alert. So South Korea and I think Incheon are within artillery distance of the border.
Yep.
So that's becoming incredibly tense as well.
Yeah.
And Russia is significantly deepening its strategic alliance, and China's deepened its strategic alliance with the North. So there is this coordination going on. Venezuela had a coup attempt, recently a protest movement, but really that coup was stopped by the fact that in many ways the Russians and the Iranians are backing the Venezuelan leadership. You had Venezuela was talking about taking part of Guyana. We spoke about this, which is possibly another sort of pressure thing. The British had to send a ship down there, which again is over oil. We've had throughout the sort of what's being called unkindly the coup belt of the sort of Sahel in Africa, multiple coups where countries were either Western aligned or French aligned, and various different revolutionary leaders have come in and then made them Russian aligned. And then the Balkans, I won't go into it, but the Balkans, former Yugoslavia, multiple tensions, almost attempted coups, Russian involvement there is really key. So we're seeing these just tension, it's not just one tension point, multiple tension points around the world.
Yeah. And they're all very interconnected.
They're interconnected.
Yeah.
So this is what the other difference is. So there's been different times where there's a war over here and then there's a war over there and there's not a lot of interconnectivity. But really, the big question behind this strategically is we clearly now have in the world a sort of US, NATO bloc, add in that Australia, Japan, South Korea. Then there's a bunch of countries which are non-aligned, many of them in the global south. And when Ukraine happened and the sanctions happened, a lot of them said, well, it's not our fight. And you've seen this increased turning against the West, whereas maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the US had more sway in the world. But then you're seeing this definite block of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba there, which are interconnecting. And the BRICS network, which is started as Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is growing. So you're seeing this real interconnective block that is economically posturing itself against the US-led order, but these particular countries posturing themselves politically and militarily against the US-led international order.
I think I just find it fascinating that interconnectivity in that this isn't just a little flashpoint between two countries. And I think maybe that's the shift I'm trying to, Russia, Ukraine kind of thing. It's just a little thing like a spat happening.
Yeah.
But this is, you just begin to join the dots, get your red string out and your pins and you realize, oh, hang on, this is actually involving a fair chunk of the world.
And, so just before Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a meeting where Putin and Xi met. And everything in those things is scripted and a signal. And I think that maybe Putin was I can't remember if Putin was in China or Xi was in Russia. I think Putin went to China. But I just remember them standing in front of all the cameras and they were saying goodbye. And I think Xi said something like, what we're about to do is going to change the face of the world for over 100 years or something like this, And so there's no doubt that there is an interconnection relationship. Their strategic documents say this, their language says this. It's really how deep is this? And then this next question is how much strategic coordination is there in this? Are the North Koreans being told to blow up the roads because it means the US has to keep an eye over there, and the US has moved its assets to the Middle East. Its Navy assets, does that help then if China wants to take Taiwan? There's all these dynamics going on. So I think you're right. The game changer is this interconnectivity, and you've got a couple of 2, 3, 4 nuclear powers there meeting the US. So obviously they can't meet the US when it's just one. If it was just Russia versus the US, or even China versus the US. But when you've got this interconnected countries and you look at all the dynamics, around that, it's that's the concern.
And increasingly more concerning than it was, you were making the connections at the beginning of the episode between the precursors to World War I and now looking at the similarities that are happening now. Would you say it's far more concerning now because of the interconnectivity that we can see happening? Yeah.
So, one of the great concerns is nuclear. So you didn't have nuclear in World War I mean, mind you, they killed a lot of people with just rifles and guns, but that danger is there. And I think the difference is, in Europe back then, it was cables and diplomats handing letters. The internet just creates this very high-speed world. A photo of a child dying in Gaza goes around the world in seconds, and then there's a protest in Malaysia, against that. So I think going through those original things that we looked at from Christopher Clark, is there decisions without awareness of the larger strategic effects being made? Yes. The US election and decisions being made around that is definitely affecting. And almost the politics, I was thinking about this last night. If you go back, Obama had, rightly or wrongly, they had grand strategy. Obama's was, we're going to move away from the Middle East, we're going to move away from Saudi, we're going to pivot to Pacific and Asia because it's the Asian century. George Bush's sort of, neoconservative agenda of, there's this moment for liberal democracy, let's change the Middle East. You see throughout history, the US, as has led the world order since this end of the Second World War, has had a grand strategic, sort of like direction. It feels more now that, and to be honest, I think some of those things have created to our current instability, but it almost feels now like you're watching a game of sport where your team has no chance of winning. You don't want to lose by 5 goals. And if you're getting a draw, that's good. And you're just hanging on for dear life. It feels like that. And almost politics now is we are just scrambling to not go into utter catastrophe. That's what it feels like. Whilst the US is in a consequential election season, I think the other thing I'm seeing is that these small decisions are being made which are creating escalation.
Yeah.
So what's the grand vision in Ukraine? What's the grand vision in what happens in the Middle East? There's this sort of like, we'll hand them these jets, or we'll do this, or we'll try and do these. The diplomatic efforts are just failing horribly. Yeah. Like, let's look at this. Blinken will come out and say, we're going to have this peace thing. It's not working. And I think the part of that's these interlocking alliances in blocks, and that geopolitical national tensions are overriding the rational decision making. And you've got a generation of, particularly I think in the West, diplomats who are of a previous era, and some of them are not that old, a previous era where rationality will rule and countries will make rational decisions, but you're definitely seeing these irrational decisions. I think they pretty much admitted it. I think one of the leaders of Hamas admitted it, that they did October the 7th to completely ruin the Abraham Accords. To just do this, because if the Abraham Accords had happened, the issue of Palestine would have been forgotten, and they knew they were done. So we're just going to do something like intense and insane to just blow everything up.
Yeah.
So when you've got people, you're in an interconnected global system where you're trying to keep it stable, you're dealing with people blowing everything up. What on earth do you do? It's like you're trying to stop everyone having COVID and lock everything down, but then you've got people who are running around trying to actively give people COVID. That's sort of the dynamic we're in.
Yeah.
And I just think we're seeing, we've talked about before, the fact that you're seeing leaders come in and become radically unpopular. Like Keir Starmer, talked about in Britain, is just at record low. They won a landslide election, record lows of popularity, and you could say that of many countries, because I think people are seeing now the inability of our leaders to deal with the complexity and the external threats. So it's not just like throw out these soundbite statements and everything's going to be okay and we just need a bit of a plan and we'll get there, we'll muddle our way through. It's just not happening, and people are seeing that. I saw yesterday, I think it was the US, I can't remember what I saw this, but I think something like only 32% of Americans, both left and right, trust mainstream media narratives now. So there is a massive legitimacy crisis happening in politics because they see people who are simply unable to deal with the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And just to add that too, tech is changing everything. We're seeing how cheap drones. The US had full spectrum dominance, which was a military strategy because they just could afford the most stuff.
Yes.
Cheap drones are like destroying stuff. And, you think about the Houthis will send a drone against a tanker, and then the US has got to fire a super expensive multi-million-dollar thing to shoot it down, or a cheap rocket versus a multi-million cruise missile. So tech is changing things, and there's an internet side of that, information war, And so many of these battles, while there's definitely issues we see around, we've been in a world where the language we've spoken on is justice in the last few years, which is totally understandable. So people will come with the idea of morality, moral warfare. But the reality is it's the world is being driven by these deep, long-standing tensions, but also energy. Like a lot of these battles are over Belt and Road, the BRICS alliance, where does energy come from? Gas coming from Russia. And that world is a rude shock to people who, if you've been shaped by the last sort of 10, 20 years. The hard assessment to make is there is a sense that the trend line is that we just seem to be sleepwalking into war. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm off on this. Maybe the US election will change things. My sense is I don't see how these things change quickly with leadership changes in the EU, the US. I think there's underlying structural dynamics that are driving this stuff.
Yeah. So what then is our response as people of faith? Yeah.
I know. I mean, this is like, oh my goodness, like how do you give a neat little wrap up at the end? It's really hard. I did a video, or Pete Gregg did a video with me we were in San Francisco the other day, and he had this. We were both sort of talking about this stuff and felt the need that hang on, we've got to get Christians praying about this. And he gave the example at the beginning of the little video that the Russian Orthodox Church on the eve of the Russian Revolution, which tore Russia apart, civil war leading to the rise of the Soviet Union. They were debating the color of vestments that priests should wear. He's making the point that sometimes Christians can be, distracted. We can be distracted by, our own business. I think there is a large amount, of the culture war has taken up a lot of gas for people. If you've been shaped by that 2016 to 2022 period, I think we all sensed when we did that Ukraine war episode that, wow, this is a game changer. Politically. And, so I think number one, this has changed things, I was talking to someone too recently, like we talk about the environment, which, I think is a huge issue. But I was sort of a bit surprised when they talk about climate change. And I said, what if nuclear war is now higher risk than climate change, And I feel a bit shocked. And, people don't want to think like this. But I think, I think of the classic book, Intercessor, by Norman Grubb about Rees Howells. And Rees Howells, this Welsh intercessor, didn't, he had a sort of bit of a platform developing, and then he sort of gave it up to just pray. This is a guy just praying in his bedroom upstairs. And there's almost some chutzpah in that. I think that when you look at the scriptures, and when you particularly look at Jewish understanding of prayer, there is this element of chutzpah, almost boldness, like almost annoying pestering of God. And, I think at moments like this, if this can't invite us into prayer, I don't know what can. And I think this needs to invite us into a sort of contending style of prayer. I think Pete had some great ways to pray at the end of that video. And maybe we can put that in there or write them down and put them in there. You've got them here.
Yeah.
Read them out.
So he encouraged people to be praying. He had 3 Ps.
Correct.
Praying for the people affected, praying for the peacemakers, those who are working to make peace, and also the pastors and the priests that are on the ground in these countries that are working with the people who are, grieving and have lost their homes, all sorts of different circumstances. So, people affected, peacemakers, pastors and priests.
I think you had paramedics. Maybe you didn't get that in the video as well.
No, it wasn't in the video.
Ps, all Ps, which is great.
Yeah.
So I just think this is a call to prayer. I think that also too, this is my sense is, I've talked before, I think it was the Andrew Breitbart comment that, politics lies culture from downstream, and then I changed it to culture lies downstream from geopolitics. And, I think this is going to change the world, and let's be aware of this sort of stuff as well. And I think, like it's it's a motivating factor because in a sense you do, like many people hear this and feel out of control, like, you know, and I think we've had this like sense of you can change the world and, you know, one voice, you know, and there's an element like that is true, but I think there's also an element that these dynamics are so massive that it does drive us to a humility that, you know, we just have to cry out for God, you know. But, you know, I think of Exodus, God hears the groaning of his people.
Yes. Yeah. Can I share something? We started with World War I and I was recently in Wellington and I went to the museum there and they had a Gallipoli exhibition and Gallipoli was one of the battles that occurred during World War I, and there were a lot of Australian troops involved in that, but also a lot of New Zealand troops involved in that. And in this exhibition in Wellington, New Zealand, they had this little prayer book that had a bullet in it. So this the prayer book saved the life of a private, and it stopped a bullet in its tracks. And interestingly, they had the prayer book there, and the verse, which is in Maori, so I couldn't read it, but they did a translation of it, says, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." And for me, that's just this reminder that regardless of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, there is a God who is far stronger, far more sovereign, and beyond our ability to contain or understand, that we can rely on, that we can depend on, that's what he's invited us to as his people.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining us today. A bit of a marathon episode. Thank you so much, Mark, for bringing clarity and, yeah, I guess simplifying in a way the really, really complex stuff that's going on in our world and giving us an ability to understand to an extent, what's happening and how we can maybe respond to it prayerfully and bringing it continually to God. And just a reminder at the end, we have our live episode, a live recording next Tuesday. And if you are in Melbourne and would like to come, haven't signed up yet, we have plenty of tickets, plenty of space for you. The tickets are free, but your booking is required so that we know to put out a chair. So we would love to see you there. We're looking forward to it. We've got Al Gordon from Saint, who is the head of Renaissance Movement. We look forward to talking about all things renewal and creativity. So please join us.